Welcome to this nice, warm Saturday morning. As Jonathan said, we are reinstating the student symposium. It's an annual student symposium. We used to have it some time back, and then it fell into abeyance. And then hopefully it'll come back in full strength, and we'll continue it for the years to come. We are heartened by the response we got with the papers and the panels that were built up through the help of Jonathan and Stefan, who are the real organizers of this symposium. And we're really thankful to all of you who've contributed your ideas, your papers, and of course now your presence. So as Jonathan said, the symposium is sort of divided into the 4 quadrants through which EWP operates at present. It's not exact, and it shouldn't be, because nothing is, watertight. Everything is porous. Every entity, every element includes all other elements. And so hopefully it'll be a chance for synergy, for good inclusion of all in each. So I think that's enough to talk about the overall symposium. The structure of the symposium has already been given out in the nice booklet that was prepared by Jonathan for this symposium that contains introductions to all of you, all the contributors. The schedule is given in the first 2 pages. There is a morning session and an afternoon session. The morning session will run from now, that is from 9 o'clock to 12:30, and it includes 2 panels. The first panel, which will start now, is a panel that is roughly mapped to the Eastern side of East-West psychology. It's called Eastern Wisdom Traditions and the Arts. It'll go till 10:45 p.m. and it has 3 participants. Each of the sections has 3 participants. Each panel has 3 participants. We will actually move at 11 o'clock to a panel on terror psychology, shamanism, and ancestral remembrance. 12:30 to 1:30, there'll be a lunch break, a 1-hour lunch break. And then we'll come back at 1:30 and go for another 1.5 hours on psychosexuality and dismantling internalized oppression. And finally, 3:15 to 4:45, the panel will be on the world component, occult and magical technologies of decolonization. Each of the participants or panelists will address you for approximately 20 minutes. That's the length of the presentation, after which there'll be a 5-minute window for you to interact with the participant, ask questions, clarifications, etc. And at the end, the moderator will make some comments on the entire panel. So this is how we have structured the symposium for today. And without further ado, I'd like to open it up with the first panel, which is the panel on Eastern Wisdom Traditions and the Arts. So Eastern Wisdom Traditions and the Arts, the 3 panelists are Paige Barrows, Hemalatha Swaminathan, and Jonathan K. We'll start our panel with Paige. The presentation is titled Absolute Liberation from Suffering, Means of Self-Realization in Advaita Vedanta. And a few words on the presenter. Paige Barrows is pursuing her MA in East-West Psychology, the culmination of 20 years of scholarly and esoteric pursuits. These have included attaining fluency in ancient Greek at UCLA, a post-baccalaureate in classics at Penn, as well as time studying the Diamond Approach and Kabbalah. Paige became a certified consultant in the Akashic Wisdom School of Knowing in 2017, as well as a spirit-led practitioner in 2019. She has completed a collection of essays about body image and self-esteem following her body positivity activism as one of the first plus-sized fashion models signed by Wilhelmina Models in New York and Ford Models in Los Angeles in the 1990s. Paige recognized her long-sought spiritual home in Advaita Vedanta during former CIIS core faculty Dr. Carol Whitfield's course on Eastern theories of self-mind and nature. She brings an intuitive storytelling approach to teaching math to teens in her private coaching practice in San Francisco. Without further ado, Paige Barrows.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Can you all hear me? Is my audio working? Great. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I am honored to be included in the symposium and by your presence. Today, I'm going to be presenting on the potential for freedom Advaita Vedanta offers us. Some of this content may be new to those in attendance who've not yet had the opportunity to study the philosophical schools of Hinduism from India. I've been deeply moved by the realizations and awareness that arose for me in studying Advaita Vedanta, but I'm still an absolute newcomer to this rich tradition. I look forward with anticipation to Professor Banerji's course this fall on the transformative themes in the Upanishads. The title of my presentation and paper is Absolute Liberation from Suffering, Means of Self-Realization in Advaita Vedanta. The purpose of this paper is to help readers focus upon the wisdom offered by Advaita Vedanta in the alleviation of suffering. Here I address personal and cultural examples of the application of this knowledge path and its liberatory effects. This discussion will include the potential for suffering inherent in the Western containing myth. Key points include the pain caused by believing the promises of a consumer society, trying and failing to attain lasting inner peace by dieting and pursuing cultural standards of beauty and perfection, and the pursuit of spiritual realization at any cost. The concept of a containing myth can be loosely defined as the beliefs, thoughts, and societal norms we take for granted growing up in our cultures and families. Imagine a fish underwater, unaware it is swimming through water, for the liquid surroundings are all it knows. It takes the water for granted. We spent significant time in the first semester of the East-West Psychology Master's Program thinking about our own containing myths, those of our families, religions, and cultures. In Western countries, such as the United States, clearly there's an abundant emphasis on status and success, the acquisition of wealth and desirable possessions, and maintaining our bodies and youthful appearances. The correction of this ill-fated pursuit of happiness requires first acknowledging the unsteady nature of the ego's wants and needs. Next, an admission of the fleeting satisfaction that meeting those egoic demands brings. Finally, an embrace of the wisdom that lasting peace lies not in the attainment of our desires, but rather in the deeper realization of the true nature of our underlying non-dual self. Non-dual means not two, just one. Life is fundamentally one fabric, and though we may see and think of things and ourselves as separate, everything is actually one. Some refer to this as unity consciousness, though this tradition takes that concept to a deeper level. The principal requirement for liberation from suffering is therefore removing the blinding ignorance of the ego mind and its false identification with our bodies, personalities, life circumstances, preferences, and aversions. In addition, it's necessary to see through the mind's tendency to separate and categorize everything in its path. Liberation in the Advaita Vedanta tradition is defined as overcoming the primary problem of ignorance of who and what the self is, and realizing it is in fact the non-dual self of all creation. As Dr. Carol Whitfield says in her 1999 book, Advaita Vedanta, Vedanta and Self-Knowledge, the realization of the identity between the individual and God is liberation. The self is recognized as limitless, timeless, and changeless, one with God, and one in whom not only the creation rests, but who in fact is the very substance of the creation. The full impact of this teaching includes the awareness that attaining perfect looks, status, or other material circumstances will never bring the kind of lasting peace and happiness that only the realization of self as the unchanging foundation of our being can bring. Here I identify the Advaita Vedanta path of realization as one that brings a profound recognition of finally arriving at this truth, accompanied by a sense of homecoming on the deepest level. So, Advaita Vedanta's path of liberation. Liberation in this tradition rests on acquiring the knowledge of the true nature of oneself as the self that illuminates all of existence, manifested and unmanifested, unbound by time and space. Within Vedanta, there is just one self, which is the fabric of the known and unknown universe from beginningless time. The Advaita Vedanta tradition recognizes 6 valid means of knowledge, pramanas, while the foundational truth underlying liberation does not depend on any of these. They contain a crucial means for acquiring knowledge, and the acquisition of this knowledge is the very basis for liberation. Of these 6 means, direct study with a realized teacher is the most direct and necessary path. I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to have engaged in this vital practice with former East West Psychology core faculty professor Carol Whitfield. I think many of us can relate to this next section, the quest for pleasure and success in life rather than liberation. Professor Whitfield pointed out in class lectures during March of 2021 that most people do not want true liberation from suffering. Rather, they're trying to figure out how to live the happiest and most successful life. The illusion that somehow pleasure can be had without its counterpart, pain, is extremely compelling to the human ego and mind, and trumpeted in our Western culture. Indeed, in our consumer-driven capitalistic society, we depend upon this delusion that we can be liberated from the mundane, boring, unhappy circumstances of our lives and transported into lasting happiness through the acquisition of a thing, state, experience, or success. With this shiny new car, the consumer programming informs us, you can be truly everlastingly happy for only 3.9% APR. Or it continues, with the right plastic surgery, the beauty and privilege of youth will remain forever within your grasp. Advertisements suggest that surely jetting to a fabulous featured destination will reboot and inspire you, rekindle your romance, and make your kids behave while you relax in luxury. This false liberation is fleeting at best, leading to either frustration of unmet desires, disappointment when their fulfillment does not create a lasting state of peace nor happiness, or the unwelcome arising of a fresh new desire when the prior one is filled. I fell prey to this delusional conviction early on, and my ensuing journey of pleasure, pain, and seeking liberation in the wrong places has been one of my greatest spiritual teachings. The only child of adoring parents, I had neither the conceptual framework nor the early childhood development necessary to grasp the sudden loss of my father to a cycling accident before my second birthday. In the face of such grief and powerlessness, with the magical thinking of a child, I believed that only if I were more perfect or pleasing, well-behaved or pretty, my father would either not have vanished or might return. The primary threats to manifesting that goodness were my hair, which kept tangling and refusing to be combed and braided evilly in French braids, and my predilection for sweets. While the containing myth within my family was more spiritually oriented than most, we did not escape the goals typical of a consumer society. I can see how my childhood experiences and the containing myth I grew up in set me up well for a preoccupation with body image and a conflicting penchant for emotional eating. My consuming pursuit of a beautiful fit body and appearance contributed greatly to both my suffering and illusion that attaining one would liberate me from not only the pain of being overweight, but from all pain. My fundamental misunderstanding was thinking that this kind of superficial victory would lead to lasting happiness. Through the decades that followed, my focused effort on controlling my appearance was characterized by my conviction that if I could just get it right, everything would fall into place and work out perfectly. Here was my belief that not only looking good, but looking good in an extremely specific, narrow way was the ticket in this life to the good things, to freedom from suffering, a VIP pass to a life filled exclusively with pleasure, no pain. I took up modeling with the Wilhelmina Agency in New York at the end of my junior year of college. This pursuit perfectly mirrored my misunderstanding of who and what I am. At the time, it felt like I was moving closer to my goal of liberation from pain through presenting well, especially with the body activism piece. That summer presented many difficulties, which surprised me at the time, and I moved from New York back to Los Angeles for my senior year at UCLA. I thought if I could only have my student life, friends in Los Angeles, and the status and social approval possible through modeling, then I would be free from suffering. I couldn't recognize the folly of this at the time. 2 years later, another attempt at a geographic cure followed when I moved back across the country to Philadelphia this time, thinking an Ivy League graduate school, the University of Pennsylvania, would make all the difference. It took many more strict diets before I caught on that even when I succeeded at these, I was neither happier nor more fulfilled than before I started. I did not understand that both my identity as a straight A student at UCLA and fashion model only deepened my false sense of self, confusing it with my intellect, body, appearance, and achievements. Furthermore, I was baffled and disillusioned when years of restrictive eating didn't shelter me from heartache, rejection, or multiple injuries. So much for lasting happiness. I needed more depth in my containing myth and an introduction to what liberation means, to even comprehend why my pursuit of pleasure was leading to even more pain. The Hindu containing myth fulfills this need with both its knowledge of the absolute liberation that is possible and the means for achieving it. As Chaudhuri and Datta wrote in 1968, and the Vedanta philosophy, An Introduction to Indian Philosophy, freedom from suffering must be a direct knowledge or clear realization of the fact that the self is not the body and senses, the mind and the intellect. Over the past several years, through intense seeking of spiritual truth, I have finally realized that even if I were ever to arrive at looking good enough, unencumbered by cravings for sweets, I would not be any closer to attaining lasting happiness and success. This stale belief created in my psyche and the dominant culture is not true. These beliefs reflect the great illusion of considering oneself as an object, somewhat separate from the subject who is perceiving that object, and definitely not the self who underlies all of creation. While I would still prefer to embody the fitness and youth of my modeling days, the importance of achieving a specific look is so much less significant than I ever imagined, and negligible when it comes to any lasting freedom from suffering. From Professor Carol Whitfield, I learned that even when we glimpse the self through experiences, met desires, heightened spiritual events, we often misunderstand the cause of this phenomenon and then repeatedly seek it out. We attribute the momentary feeling of fullness, wholeness, and peace for the vehicle that got us there, rather than understanding that the self we may have seen during these transitory experiences is in fact the ever-present underlying self. She writes about this in her 1997 book, Advaita Vedanta, The Self, and shared this with us in class during her lecture on April 23rd of 2021. We identify with the experience and the way it made us feel, not recognizing that the underlying self illuminating the experience was the cause of that experience. In my personal pursuits as a spiritual seeker, chasing wholeness via expensive retreats in beautiful but distant locations, I missed that the source of the immense peace and realization I sought lay within all along as the one having experiences. The natural beauty and planned activities which characterized these retreats allowed my mind, body, and emotions to grow still. This had the effect of calming the waters of my mind and psyche so that I could see through to the radiant, luminous peace coming from underneath the water, from myself. My seeking and chasing these experiences and momentary realizations were fleeting, and I often felt even more contraction and dissatisfaction after they ended. I grew increasingly frustrated as this cycle kept repeating, especially given the sacrifices I was incurring to attend these retreats. Desire for knowledge of how to reconnect with the wholeness I had had precious little experience of drove my decisions. Why was this happening? And why did none of my self-proclaimed enlightened teachers have a satisfying explanation? They reassured me that many have a similar experience of the cyclical contraction and expansion of consciousness and encouraged me to keep meditating. I was left with only the hope that one day, the jarring contrast of vast, expansive realization, followed by an even stronger contraction back into the narrow, shellacked confines of my ego mind, would end, and I would be left with just the realized state. What I needed was the knowledge of what was truly happening and how to access the peace I felt in a lasting way. As Professor Whitfield writes in her 1999 book, Advaita Vedanta, The Vedanta and Self-Knowledge, in reality, the self has always been liberated. The problem of bondage and liberation, therefore, does not belong to the self, but rather to the individual who takes himself or herself to be limited. The problem is one of self-ignorance, whose solution lies only in self-knowledge. And self is capitalized here to represent the one self that is Brahman. I now realize I'm whole and complete, regardless of my body, appearance, or any other aspects of my life, which can be objectified. While I had been on this path of realizing my innate worthiness, wholeness, and intrinsic lovability for several years, I was more focused on what I was not, a body object to be judged by myself or others, than what I am. Furthermore, until the knowledge of the Advaita Vedanta path was shared with me by Professor Whitfield, I lacked the ability to place self-realization within a non-dual reality. Doing so creates vast spaciousness and changes the meaning I ascribe to the moments of fullness and wholeness I've had on retreats and in meditation in nature. Moreover, it is only in discerning this separation of everything objectifiable about my life experience from my actual self that the end of ignorance and beginning of liberation can truly commence. The end. Thank you for staying with me.
Thank you so very much, Paige. And I think we can open it for some questions and answers. There's about 5 minutes of that. Paige has been extremely conscientious about keeping time, so we can enjoy some conversation with her. Sorry, Rachel Moore. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Paige, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I can tell that you've done extensive amounts of research on this, and I'm wondering if you are seeing any similarities within other cultures of this oneness, with the Upanishads or Judaism. Have you found that this is a cross-cultural phenomenon, that cultures are seeking this kind of elevated consciousness?
What a beautiful question. I wish I could respond more fully across different belief systems. It does feel to me like a lot of the language around sort of the one God, unity consciousness, it does seem to come from different traditions. For me personally, this is the path that allowed me to land in that feeling and really feel the wholeness of that. But I think that's a beautiful observation. And I think there is definitely the potential, if not the deep teaching of that within different traditions. But I'm not really qualified to speak, but thank you for that question.
Any more questions? Weston.
Hi, Paige. Thank you. So I love the research or the diving into your experience of the oneness, and I just have a really maybe a practical, tactical question. What's one thing that you do in a day that there's one thing to be in the research, but what's one thing that you do in a day that brings it right down into the moment for you and says, I'm here?
You know, I like to watch the Golden State Warriors win playoffs games. That really gives me that sense of fullness. I do a lot of meditation practice in our backyard here in Oakland. Really lucky to have a sunny backyard and a beautiful climate when it's not smoky from the wildfires. And I I sit back there often in the cultivated plants and flowers. And I find that when I sit in that area in the backyard, take in our magnolia tree, feel the sunshine, it really helps me shed whatever sort of stressful, egoic things I might have taken on inside the house, and to drop back into that realization, I am a part of this. This is also who I am. We are all not only connected, but just made up of this one golden fabric.
Dana.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paige. I'm wondering, it sounds like your containing myth has shifted. What might it be now?
Oh, what a beautiful question, Dana. Thank you. It has shifted, and just becoming aware of why my previous sort of Western typical consumer containing myth was making me so unhappy has been just hugely liberating. Yeah, I've been very grateful to get to know some of the tenets of the Hindu containing myth. And it helped me also understand why I didn't ever feel as home within the Western containing myth. As a very little girl, for instance, reincarnation was just something that I knew. And I recently asked my mother, when did you tell me about reincarnation? And she said, oh, honey, I never taught you that. So growing up with some of these aspects that were resonant in other cultures, particularly in the Hindu containing myth, and then discovering, oh, this, millions of people think these things and believe these things. It was just very, very helpful. Could you restate your question, Dana? It was so good, and I feel like I'm losing the thread.
You're doing great. Yeah, it was just, what is your new containing myth now? And yeah, I think you're answering it.
Thank you. Yeah, my new containing myth is that this kind of liberation is possible, but it's also so achingly beautiful to still be caught in the duality. It's really highlighting for me the preciousness of every moment with our cats, with my family and friends. Every moment the Warriors are up in the score. And I've had more compassion, I think, with this new containing myth for when I get completely caught back in, the web of illusion and delusion and egoic concerns and, being anxious about blow drying my hair before the presentation and thinking that was, really important. So it's allowed me to have this broader container that even if I don't necessarily fill, I can have more distance from and more spaciousness with. I'd love the newer car to get my car washed, but I know it will just be fleeting pleasure. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for all your questions and for the little conversation that we had around this. I think it's time for us to move on to the next speaker. The next panelist is Hemalatha Swaminathan. And Hemalatha is a dual master's degree holder in organizational and counseling psychology, and she's now pursuing her PhD in East-West psychology. She's a practicing psychologist and founder of Force Within in India, with a keen inclination towards art therapy. Being from a dance and theater background, she has always been passionate about art and its ability to connect to the deeper consciousness. She is an award-winning theater performer and playwright, performing in national and international theater festivals. Her visual poetry has been published in the IEATA newsletter regularly. She's also the recipient of the Reena Sarkar Scholarship this year, January 22, for pursuing research in Asian rituals and mental wellness. Currently, she's engaged in designing a curriculum that focuses on contemplative studies and pedagogy using contemplative practices of movement, art, and theater. Hemlatha's title of her paper is The Moon Girl, a reflective paper on finding my containing myth through art. Hemlatha, it's all yours.
Thank you, Professor. A very good morning to all my fellow presenters and all those who have taken the time out here to witness our work. Paige, I think mine's just going to be a continuation of a thought that you have set rolling. And today I would like to present this paper of mine that took shape in the fall of 2021 under the guidance of Professor Ishtar and Professor Carroll. I'd like to begin with a question that came up for me during the course, and are our actions directed in pursuit of happiness or avoidance of grief? I believe that if one has experienced suffering, then one does her best to avoid grief in every possible manner. Then what does one's dharma look like? Is one even conscious of the choices made when the intent is to avoid suffering and grief and not experience joy and happiness? These are some questions that came up for me in the Introduction to EWP course. In this reflective paper, I'd like to share my journey as an Indian girl from an Orthodox Hindu family that engages in the rituals of rites of passage when a girl attains puberty. These rituals have left a deep scar on my connection with my body until I found my containing myth, the moon. I began to listen to the moon and I felt I was listening to my body and mind, my psyche. I began an art journal to record this relationship in sketches. The art journal and the materials used are testimony to the evolving relationship that I was building with myself and the cosmos. Myth is a perspective that connects the personal to the cosmos. My personal myth that was full of chaos and anger found anchor in the cosmos through the moon. It held, soothed, and calmed me. Connecting to the moon helped me to connect to myself. My artwork was enabling me to create a containing myth for myself to overcome a suffering. One's containing myth provides an anchor that one can hold on to in suffering, makes one feel safe and protected, and enables one to connect to the world and its events from a safe container. In this paper, I also present my sketches that have helped me reconnect with my body and understand the cycle of my body. I felt safe, nurtured, and beautiful as I emerged from this process. This paper describes my personal metamorphosis, moving from fear and frustration to self-love and offering support to women. What are these rites of passage? This ritual is an initiation to leave behind one mode of being and enter into new life circumstances. However, they can create a period of disintegration and turmoil that may lead to greater sanity and well-being. At 13, my world turned upside down. Suddenly, everybody began noticing my body. I had attained puberty. In India, it's an occasion for celebration and initiation of a rite of passage for the girl. In indigenous cultures, these rites of passage were practiced to result in higher integration for the individual in a manner that enabled her to let go of the old and be born into the new. The rites of passage at puberty were meant to symbolically enable the girl to take on the responsibilities and duties of an adult. But the well-meaning ritual becomes a traumatic experience for the child if she is not guided emotionally through this. These rites of passage become doorways to child marriage, dropping out of education system, and being burdened with household activities for the little girl. Every family has its own superstitions around it. In a patriarchal family, this would mean having the girl out of sight for the days that she is menstruating. She would stay in an extended part of the house and her movement would be limited to the washroom. She would not come in contact with the male members of the family, as this is believed to defile the pure man. She is considered impure and untouchable during those days. Menstrual Health in India, Country Landscape Analysis, was funded by the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation to study the impact of menarche on girls. This report is the result of a review of over 60 peer-reviewed articles and grey literature, over 30 interviews with experts and practitioners in India, and a review of relevant programming focused on menstrual health. The majority of girls in India lack awareness about menstruation before menarche. Their first experience of menstruation, which is mentioned in detail in this analysis, is often associated with shame, fear, and agony. Several regional studies have also indicated that menstruating girls are not aware of the biological reasons associated with menstruation and in fact perceive this to be a disease. One cannot even begin to imagine the impact of shame, guilt, and fear on the psyche of the young girls. Many girls and her influencers, which is essentially the primary family members, follow cultural practices and perpetuate taboos that restrict the girl's mobility and activity during menstruation. While these practices vary across regions and families, common discriminatory practices include restrictions on living and eating, cooking for the family, restrictions on visiting the temple, using flowing sources of water such as rivers and streams. Mothers and grandmothers can be particularly influential in perpetuating these taboos across generations. Data shows that girls are largely on par with boys up to adolescence, but with the onset of puberty, outcomes for girls have begun to diverge and girls face increasing restrictions on their mobility and agency. This analysis was published in 2016, not very long ago. My first encounter with shame and humiliation was from a grand uncle whom I happened to touch on my periods, my first one. I was very happy to have him visit us after many years. I was shattered when he pushed me away and ran to the bathroom to have a bath. I felt dirty. Being from an all-woman household, I was allowed to sleep inside the house and move around anywhere except the kitchen and the puja room, which is the altar or the shrine. However, this privilege is not extended to every woman. Some rural women live in shabby outhouses. Some are asked to stay in a small hut outside their village, which are often unsafe. Women have been raped and robbed during such monthly adventures. How do these years affect women? On days when they need comfort and love, they are separated from family and left to fend for themselves physically and emotionally. Studies based in states including Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu have shown that during menstruation, girls are asked to stay away from religious spaces, kept in isolation, not allowed to play outside or even go to school. Girls have reported feeling anxious, guilty, and shocked due to lack of information about menstruation prior to menarche. What does it mean to be not able to communicate with loved ones or not have them listen to you at the tender age of 18? What impression does this leave on the mind of the young teenager about their body? I know I had begun to detest those days. I didn't want to be seen as sitting aloof as if I had an infectious disease. I began to see the hypocrisy with which woman's body was accepted in society. I felt that as long as it was functional and sexually available, it was accepted. Otherwise, it was shunned and isolated. On some days, I wish I had never been born a girl. One would believe that if a tradition pays so much attention to how a woman should conduct herself during her menstrual cycle, then it surely would also focus on her comfort, discomfort, or any illness that arises from this process. But it is not so. I experienced severe discomfort and irregularities, but these were often normalized as something every woman goes through. Painkillers were doled out as candies to bite the pain and get through the days without causing stress to anyone. The need to pause and reflect on my cycles, their irregularities and discomfort, etc., arose in therapy at the age of 40. It emerged that my erratic thoughts and mood swings seemed to have a cyclical pattern. I would observe an angry me, a resentful me, and then a totally happy me. Similarly, I would be very organized, planned, and meticulous on some days, while some days I would just not stop without executing self-sabotage. The pattern would manifest in my mind and body at least a week or 10 days before my menstrual cycle. For years, I thought it was just the sensitive me. In therapy, it slowly began to all make sense. The condition, its symptoms, its mental and physical manifestations, and my responses to it. I slowly began to observe my cycles and the cycles of the moon. I began to connect to my body and listen to it. I realized that a lot of my anger and resistance to love my body were creating stress in my body and adversely affecting my premenstrual symptoms. Engaging in art enabled me to understand this cycle of my body. When I was first asked by my therapist to describe how I felt as a 13-year-old experiencing my PMS, I made this following artwork. I call it The Hollow That Bleeds. And this is what I wrote about it. I'm supposed to be enjoying my teenage and I want to breathe in the fresh air. But all I can feel is that the swing that I'm sitting on is made of thorns, and that makes me bleed. There is a tree that holds me and supports me, but it bleeds too. This is a tree of all my ancestors, the women before me, who have suffered neglect and rejection, and have not been able to connect to their bodies with love and affection. How could they provide me with what they didn't have themselves? I can create my own space for myself and the women after me, who should not have to hold on to the thorny branches that pierce through our body. We deserve new branches that are soft, unhurtful, and full of love. Gradually, I began to recognize a pattern in my cycles that coincided with the patterns of the waxing and waning of the moon. I began to observe the moon and how my body felt at each stage. Below are excerpts from my art journal titled The Moon Girl. Drawing how my body felt at each stage of the moon helped me to connect to my menstrual cycle, my body, and my feminine energy. I slowly began to appreciate the cycle of nature and learned to accept its ebb and flow, like the tides that rise and fall to the currents of the moon. This is a no moon day. It's all dark, and I am cradled by the night. I lie on the swing, and I am unable to get up. There is no moon and no energy. I feel complete exhaustion. The darkness of the night makes me feel lonely, weepy, and isolated. This I know is the onset of premenstrual syndrome. I have to rest, take care of myself, and ensure minimum interactions that can trigger my sensitivity. It's okay to take care of myself, to take time out and walk out of social gatherings if they seem uncomfortable. The moon has just risen, and as it touches my body, I feel I have the courage to just hoist myself up a little bit and allow the rays of the moon to cool me. I begin to feel the first rays of the moon, and it seems to cool my body and mind. My body feels less weak and ready to undergo the natural process. I have taken care of myself. My body is ready, and I need not fear pain or feel dislike as I go through this process. I can draw my boundaries, and no one needs to tell me what I should do or how I should behave on these days. I will do what my body needs the most. This is the half moon, and I feel that the half moon comes seeking me. As I am able to sit up, the rays of the moon shine bright and clear. My mind and body feel healed and new. There is an experience of loss and an experience of something new being born within. My body feels like it can hold the tension of the loss and life. I realize that previously I was so caught up in the loss that it made me emotionally vulnerable and exhausted. My body is home to loss and life, home to destruction and creation, home to darkness and light, home to Shiva and Shakti. I am held by the moon. I embrace myself. I embrace the moon. I embrace the cosmos within. Aham Brahmasmi. I am the universe, and the universe resides in me. It is dynamic and evolving. The moon shines in its full glory and sheds light on my body and soul. In the light of the moon, I am able to see myself and all that my body holds. It is not just an object, it is a woman, a cauldron of emotions, thoughts, elements, and the cosmos itself resides in it. This is the moon girl. I'd like to share. Being able to find my containing myth has enabled me to be there for others. I believe I have a sneak peek into what my dharma is. I do not see my body as a storehouse of grief, but a source of immense happiness. My personal journey has taught me to pay attention to the menstrual health of my women clients. In my counseling practice, I ensure I speak to women about their menstrual health. I ask them how they are being treated during those days by their family, what they feel about it, and how it affects their connection to their body. When asked to describe what menstrual cycle feels like, most women feel confused and tongue-tied. They don't know how much to share and how much to hold back. The obvious fear is that it will be rubbished or normalized. It could take women years to realize that they need psychological support to get through this, and even when they access it, the therapist may not be equipped to handle the psychophysical complications in its entirety. Every woman menstruates for approximately 40 years of her life. How long does one depend on any kind of medication? How long does one suffer any sort of discrimination? Why should women be told how to feel in their bodies? We need to talk about menstrual health not because we are fighting patriarchy, but because we need to stop fighting our body. Menstrual wellness is mental wellness. We need to create a safe circle for women where the elderly can prepare and empower the young as they embark on this journey with their bodies. When women love themselves and their bodies, they can in unison heal the planet and redeem humanity. This embodied relationship with life will manifest in psycho-spiritual healing for the future generations too. In this work of love, harmony, and beauty, heaven and earth will be united. I'd like to close and say thank you to all of you who've been here, and these are the references which I'd like to share as I close this presentation.
Thank you, Hemlatha, for beautiful presentation. Yes, thank you so much. I think we have time for questions again. So questions to Hemlatha for her presentation.
Hemalatha, that was so beautiful and profound, and I appreciated the art and the thought and the ritual. So many levels. I'm blown away. I guess my question is about blood taboos and myths in the culture, and if you found, as you were doing your inner work, if you found any other myths that may have been misunderstood or misinterpreted, or that could be reclaimed, or models. And one of the ones, for example, in the Jewish tradition, there's Rosh Chodesh, the head of the month, the new moon, like it was an ancient day for women who often were on their moon cycle at that time to rest. And at the same time, there are these taboos that oppress women. So I'm just curious what else you found, especially once you started to do the work.
Thank you, Raisa. Thanks for your question. And I would just say maybe I could share what was personally or what I've come across, when I hear clients speak about taboos that, and I'm sure most of them are probably misinterpreted and they are out of place in time. Like maybe they made sense at some point of time, but they do not anymore, or probably the meaning is lost and it's just the practice that is continuing. So one of the myths is let's say that the person is impure and should not touch anything around. So this use of the word impure is quite misinterpreted, and sometimes then that becomes like you don't touch food, you don't touch clothes, you don't touch people. So suddenly for anyone it can be a very difficult experience, but more so for a very young child who's just gotten into this. And also the whole fear of, okay, what's happening to my body? Like I said, the whole education, the biological education is not very open. So with that shock, with that what's happening to my body, and then this alienation can be a lot difficult to take. So yes, coming back to your question, I think taboo that the person is impure is something which I find very difficult to comprehend.
Dana.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Thank you. I'm just wondering that in shifting or in producing a curriculum that shares a different understanding or shares the biological or just broadens the initiate's frame of mind, are we creating a new identity for them as well?
Yes, I think. And what would that mean? Like, if there is an identity that is created, and probably an identity that can make them feel more belonged and in their bodies.
Ika.
Hi, Hemlatha. So this is Keka, and I'm also from India. I was just a little curious about that you are speaking from the East, side of this whole knowledge system, and the problem that you are presenting sounds more like it may have two levels of help. Like one is the rational help, like basically the superstitions and things like that you're talking about is basically before the enlightenment, which we typically call the Western Enlightenment, that rationality and all that came in. And the other side is that Aham Brahmasmi and the Shiva and Shakti that you're talking about. So which one has, what do you think will be first helpful, or how do you combine these two helps that can help this kind of problem? Like, to me, it seems like, one is the irrationality part, like the infra-rationality part, and the other is, of course, being kind of subject to the conventional problems around. So, if you could elaborate on that.
I'm going to try. And I may not completely be there, but I'd just like to say that when we speak of Aham Brahmasmi or Shiva or Shakti, that is not tied down to any, it comes from a particular space, but it's not limited to that space. So so for me, I am deeply rooted in the Hindu spiritual practice. And what I am trying to bring to the platform here is that some practices still need attention, and some practices have gone wrong, and some practices and rituals seem to have an impact which we have not acknowledged. So I think that is my understanding of the rationality that we need to bring to some practices and rituals, and the way they seem to be traumatic, and that needs to be addressed. So can it be more person-centric? Any ritual that we are practicing, can it be more person-centric rather than just assuming that it works for everyone?
Thank you.
Thank you, Hemlatha. I think we'll have to draw close to the question answer session. Sorry, Julian, because we have to keep to the time. Maybe we'll get another opportunity to discuss further questions. We move on to the third speaker. This is Jonathan K. Jonathan K is a lifelong musician and is currently a PhD student in East-West psychology. Under under my mentorship, his research is exploring the intersection between Eastern wisdom traditions grounded in the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo and post-structuralist philosophy and psychology based on the work of Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. As a scholar practitioner in arts-based research, Jonathan is exploring musico-philosophical horizons between thought and sound, and his original music is based on heterocultural and trans-nomadic experimentation through contemplative models of improvisation. Jonathan produces and co-hosts the East-West Psychology podcast. His talk is titled, as you can see, Becoming Song, Contemplative Trans-Nomadic Sono-Fictioning. Jonathan. You're muted, Jonathan.
Perfect. There we go. Can everybody hear me? Thank you, Debashish. Great. Okay. So it's an honor to be presenting a recent project of mine today. There we go. Okay, so today I'm going to talk through a recent art space project titled Becoming Song, Contemplative Transnomadic Sono-Fictioning, which was a solo music album that I recorded over the course of the pandemic. And I will be releasing it hopefully next week on the Indian Posthumanism Network website, which is a group that I'm part of. And Debashish is one of the main members of. And so this musical project I started to think of in relation to my studies in EWP. And so my work a lot of the time is trying to find the horizons between thought and sound. And so this presentation is going to develop some of what I'm calling musico-philosophical concepts, which both gave rise to and resulted from this process. And so this research is just a humble attempt to try to find a language or even a poetics, a philosophical poetics of my musical experience. And I don't intend to, this isn't really generated from a speculative positionality. And it's really, I'm trying to sit in that horizon where my musical self and my thinking self can both be present, and one doesn't over or dominate the other. So some of the research questions that came up in this process, what are the conditions of transculturality? I'll be using and exploring frameworks of multiculturalism, cross-culturalism, transculturalism, and heteroculturalism. How to transgress, overturn dogmatic, authoritative, and classical images of musical thought or music thought, which is in the name of musicology, which epitomizes this. And what experimental and performative postures can help evoke the conditions of a musical and an ethical trans or heterocultural engagement, creation, and invention. So I'm going to be exploring this using the metaphysics of Gilles Deleuze and Gilbert Simondon, which deals with individuation as psychocosmological ontogenesis. And this also brings up the post-structuralist framework of philosophy and psychology too, which I believe has really helped me, and it presents possibilities of thinking the human and human potential radically differently beyond classical images of thought and anthropocentric assumptions of ourselves, and how we may and may not be musical. And I think this has helped me to find a resonance between my musical life and thinking about music, thinking musically, if you will. So the concept here I'm using here is the theater of individuation. And I've defined that from Gilles Deleuze's work as a heterogeneous territory of intensive and affective forces and singularities, which are factors in individuation. And the term I'm using here, which I think helps me think differently, is it's psychic, it's psychosocial, and it's also psychocosmological. We're in touch with forces, affects, intensities that are on a cosmological level, which are beyond being theorized through like a human centeredness. I'm using the idea of a musical life here, which is inspired by Gilles Deleuze's development of what he calls a life in his essay called Immanence, a Life. And for me, coming set in sound space, which is always more than human and psychosocial and includes, so for example, when I'm approaching music, it's not just about the instrument that I may play, or affects and other elements like history itself, the gratify that tradition, how they influence you and other listeners, for instance, of that type of music, or mentors and teachers. Techniques, so I mentioned the instruments that you play and how you adjust those instruments as well. Music notation, for instance, and recording technologies, things like that. Something like the place also is a big, can lead to having experiences and that I've identified as being important in my musical life, like the concert hall you're performing in, the practice room, let's say the forest you're walking through and hearing nature sounds or playing your instrument. And then also the culture in itself, like normative social pressures to conform or not to conform, or the idea that music is a lot of times designed to sell an image through advertising. As well as the idea that music can be activated through social movements of social justice and revolution. All of these things are to me, very important in understanding music from the perspective of a musical life in the theater of individuation. So in order to approach understanding how my music has helped me break through and break out of individual and cultural structures that don't serve me, I need to situate myself in the problems of our times and embed myself in the horizons of culture and language. And so, for example, quickly, O'Sullivan has talked about the dominant ontology of our times as capitalism. Other people have called it immanent capitalism, the idea that capital is the master signifier. And so one question I've had to approach in my life is how to decouple capital and sound or music. This has been a big challenge for me. For example, genre is the industry's way of framing all music or sound that you may produce into pre-made containers of sound space designed to package and sell more easily to targeted audience. So I rather feel that I've become and have to put the question out, how can we become participatory co-creators of heretical and nomadic sound spaces, and not merely passive consumers, spectators, or detached connoisseurs of musical experiences as cultural capital. Another important question of our times is that of cross-culturality, multiculturalism, which I mentioned earlier. And so how can one engage in an ethical way of cross, trans, or heterocultural engagement? So we definitely have to approach overcoming Orientalization and cross-cultural fetishization based on essentialized and romanticized or exotic notions of musical experiences, and not just passively consume them as cultural flavors of consumption. So as my own intersectionality here as a white Anglo-Canadian male, I feel that cross-cultural music in my life has given me platforms to explore these problems, to question my assumptions, and try to challenge cultural biases and limitations. I actually felt that this was such an important problem in my life, a problem of my becoming, that I actually felt like I need to remove myself from my own cultural container. I lived in India, and I've traveled to Japan and other parts of the world in searching for non-Western ways of musical knowing. And I deeply embedded myself in these cultures and learned the music from within the culture, becoming somewhat of an insider so that I could engage more deeply in the structures of their culture and music, and I could understand and be a responsible person in cross-cultural dynamics and try to facilitate a more open and ethical exchange. One of the big problems that the thinkers I'm coming from and the postmodern, the post-structural movement has brought up is how to move beyond representation. And so a question here is, can music be practiced as a form of thought or a music thought from a radically immanent perspective beyond transcendental illusions or authoritarian and classical images of thought? And this came up in my life in terms of accepting the authority of traditions and really being kind of determined by the gravity of what is considered good by those traditions, and not really asking myself what I found to be good or not good. One of the ways in which we can think this is, and Deleuze has in his work, Difference in Repetition, is that he's looking to question and overturn the model copy paradigm, which is based on identity and representation, which is dominant from Plato onwards. And again, how to bring this into a musical milieu it's really, the intention here is to overturn Eurocentric and humanist models of what it means to be musical and music based on representation of a fixed notion and a fixed identity of what is truthful music or what is good or beautiful music. And this is, in my life, played out in terms of one of my problems. It's just really the question of how do you conjugate, or how do you bring together two different musical materials without unconsciously subjugating one to the other based on some kind of superiority of one over the other? How do you not privilege one over the other? And this is happening, I believe, on a conscious and unconscious level. And so I think that this is a very important departure point for my work. And I think that in terms of the broader question of art, but in music here, Deleuze is asking not what does the music mean, or is it beautiful, or is it truthful, for instance, but what does it do? What does it activate in you? What are new forms of sensation that you've discovered with this music? What new organs of perception have been cultivated and can be cultivated? So again, just continuing questions here, like in a very musical way. I'm kind of improvising my way through some of these main questions that this work has presented. But how can really music be a way of knowing in itself, a music thought, as I said, and how can these models help generate new knowledges individually and collectively? And so this album that I released, there's some of the main concepts here, like the musical philosophical concepts I'm trying to develop: contemplation, experimentation, non-idiomatic improvisation, which is a form of music I was practicing, which is really the idea of that you are trying your best anyway, which is this possible or not is another question, but to not play from a certain traditional perspective, to really put into question all of the different perspectives, and not to privilege one over the other. And that's where I'm using the word nomadism, for instance, and transculturality. So here, just talking through some diagrams here to help us understand how I'm seeing and musically engaging with these problems. So cross-cultural or intercultural can be the diagram on the left. A and B are fixed and essentialized notions of what a culture is, what it can do. And C would be the product of them coming into a relation to each other, whether that's a conscious relation or a collision of sorts. That's one diagram there. The middle diagram is talking about is an image, a possibility of transcultural engagement, where A and B, two different cultures, are opened and made porous, because that is really much more true to not one authoritarian image of a cultural image, but the idea of that it's multiple things to multiple people. You cannot reduce it to one to a flatness, or you cannot frame it in a certain way. And so it's made porous. You still have the engagement in C between A and B. You also have the arising of D, which is really the what is produced from that collision in a way, or what is surrounding that. And so there's a little bit more multiplicity here, which I think is very important, and opening to realms that may be unknown. And on your right, you'll see a depiction I find fitting of heteroculturalism, which is really kind of doing your best to really make as porous as possible, and to bring as many elements into this theater of individuation, and not really try to micromanage what elements you want and what you don't want, but allow yourself to kind of become into a flow and surrender to something much greater. These images that are colored here, the one for heterocultural, is actually an artistic depiction coming from A Thousand Plateaus, which is one of Deleuze and Guattari's main works. Okay, so musical trans-nomadism. Important question that came up, that I'm raising here, and that came up in history through the voice and the music of Ornette Coleman, who you can see on the right, how to free music from the caste system of sound, from the tonal caste system. And so I think that following his example, I think the cultivation of nomadic sound space can be an alternative to alternative psychic and psychosocial space, which is always more than human, which displaces fragments and ruptures dominant anthropocentric social and symbolic social orders. And that's really putting into question something like tonality, Western tonality, which is assumed to be assumed as a transcendental given by many people, by musicology, for instance. So from this perspective, all sounds are equal, and he calls this harmolodics. And I think that this has helped me in my life create more of an ethical and a radically democratic sound space to engage in experimentation, especially trans and heterocultural. So contemplative improvisation. So I was inspired by Felix Guattari's work in Chaosmos. And, my intention here was to kind of, how do I refrain from traditional norms and etiquettes, and how do I suspend cultural authority and orthodoxy when engaging with these sonic materials? One important approach I took to help with the overdetermination of these traditionally specific structures was to couple this approach with Eastern contemplative arts by activating a contemplative posture based on this framework that we're going to talk through here. So Guattari speaks of an existential analytic. He calls this also an existential territory. And in this album, it's served as a site of transduction or exchange between heterogeneous music materials, and which also address certain existential problems of my becoming. And I feel that these existential problems were based on an intuitive openness, based on not one center of subjectivity, but multiple centers. The machinic analytic, which Guattari speaks of as incorporeal universes, are really the elements that I kind of collided and conjugated. And they're drawn from the sound spaces of jazz improvisation, Indian raga music, Japanese Hankyoku shakuhachi music. And I feel that they were sort of extracted as traces and liminal sound memories from these musical events that I'm calling are situated in my musical life. So two specific concepts that I am kind of filling these two analytics with, one being epoche from the Greek tradition, which means to interrupt or suspend, and one from the Japanese tradition, which is an aesthetic concept called ma, which means the space between. So Bernard Stiegler, I'm coming
Jonathan,
based off of his.
I think we're out of time.
Okay.
One more minute, maybe.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so I won't read this this quote here from Stiegler, but really he's talking about how epoche in his life and how I'm experimenting with it too. I'm looking to suspend programs and cliches and attitudes. And so this was important to me when I was making this album, and I feel it's becoming more important to me in making transcultural and heterocultural experimental music. The Japanese aesthetic, ma, is translated as the interval between two or more spatial temporal things or events. This is a quote from Van Damme. It is not only used to suggest measurement, but also carries a meaning of gap, opening, space between, and time between. However, this translation lacks a full understanding of the difference in approach to spatiality represented in ma. Ma is the understanding of an energized middle that makes a difference. And I wasn't intending to go into how that relates to Gilles Deleuze's works, but in Deleuze's work, he speaks about something that can be thought alongside this as the disjunctive synthesis. And so to summarize here, the main question is, what is a song? How does all of this relate to song? Well, I felt that this whole process helped me reimagine what a song can be, what a song can do, much outside of the traditional norms and assumptions that we have and how we consume these songs. And so just a thought at the end of all of this is how maybe an experimental practice of becoming song can cultivate new collective potentials based on ethical and aesthetic models of musicality and activate an aspiration to build networks of harmonious and polyphonic trans individuals as a condition of perpetual trans-nomadic revolution. And so that is a lot about music that you hopefully can hear next week. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Jonathan. Very nice. So I think a few questions for Jonathan. We'll have a little time for questions. Jean-Michel.
Jonathan, thank you. That was really fantastic. I was asking myself while listening to you, do you see any limitation in the fact that when the music is recorded, because the audience is not there? I was thinking about this conductor Chelibidake who refused, to do any recordings. And so when you're trying to create a new form of music, what is the place of the recording? And then when the audience, because the audience is not there, can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And it definitely hit me the hardest in COVID times. And so this album is really an exploration of what is possible. I think that first of all, it is important to definitely note the limitations of what you are hearing when you're hearing recorded music. And also as somebody who is recording, what are the limitations when you're not surrounded by an environment that is less artificial. For instance, you're surrounded by mic stands and mics and technology, and your mind is sort of in different places. I self-recorded this, which is again something else that came based on COVID times. So I think that it is an artificial environment, but it is also, I think that looking within and trying to kind of, you could say, tap into, let's say a historical sense of relating to all that you are and all that has influenced you. So I think that was really important to me in this. And I think that speaks also to what is the role of a recording then. I wasn't able to hear, let's say, John Coltrane, who was a big influence on me. I mean, a life-changing influence on me. How is that possible through a recording? There's something that activated in me. There's some kind of a call from a different time that was able to be I was able to be open to that, and I was able to respond and resonate with the sort of, you could say, the problem of its becoming, and I think that I hear Coltrane's music, for instance, or Ornette Coleman's music, really calling out to, what I was using, that idea of psycho-cosmological, some kind of universal cosmic aspect. So I think that, recordings can be used in that way as well. But I also think that it's important to note that when you are in the same room as somebody else, that the transmission of what is filling the room is much more than vibrations that are contained that can be recorded, basically. So yeah.
Thank you, Alexander.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. I have just one simple question. Do you think about create special digital platform or digital program there where you can combine your ideas and give another people the opportunity to create their own music or try to find their own transformational sounds or something else?
Okay, can you clarify what you mean? A digital platform like an app or something?
Because your presentation, it have very interesting visualization, and when I look at this, I think about digital program or some type of app like Spotify. But Spotify is just recommend you music. When based on your presentation, I can see some sort of digital program that help people create their own musical path and connected with soul. It's just.
Well, that's a very interesting question. Well, in my presentation, I was using the art from people that inspired me in transcultural ways, who are transcultural in themselves. Like Jyoti is an artist that Debashish and I know from Oroville, and we've released a project with him. And Fumio is an artist as well that came to CIS. And I think that, in terms of engaging in a similar questions, or you could say a similar problematic, that's where this music, this art was resonating with me and giving me kind of like awakening some of those potentials I was speaking of. It sort of charged me up in a way. And so I was using that art. Now, I think that when it comes to normalizing, or not normalizing, but kind of creating something for more than yourself or more than a very small group in which you could work. I think that if you work collectively with a small group, that would be very interesting. Like Debashish and Jyoti and my brother and I did a small exploration in this. I think that as soon as you try to frame things and sell it in a certain light, like as a genre, like transculturality becomes a genre, then there's potential to make money because there are people that are probably wanting that. But I think that also then you're running the fine line of kind of essentializing things and people accepting it like as an authority or something. So I guess that would be kind of a response based on some of the questions I raised in my presentation. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexander, and thanks, Jonathan, for your response. And thank you all of you, all panelists. It was a very beautiful and stimulating panel, beautiful talks, all three of them. There was a tremendous amount of overlap, and it showed something about the character of East-West psychology and the kinds of questions and problems that it inspires in people. The ability to think through some of these issues. I was really struck by the fact that all three talks really started from the here and now, and it started from the self. It was really about personal experience, and it acknowledged the fact that we are first and foremost here to find a place for ourselves in the world. I mean, we live a life in a world which is dominating in many ways. You pointed to capitalism, you pointed to patriarchy. It doesn't matter which culture it is, it's all over the world today. History, it has been dominated by forms of oppression. And we are recognizing that. We are recognizing the fact that we are here to understand that individually and collectively and offer solutions in individual and collective ways to that. So I really was heartened by that fact. This is what makes, autoethnography as a methodology so valuable to East-West psychological research, as many of you know. It's something that we encourage. So the analysis or the identification of a master signifier is the beginning point of recognizing the fact that there are what you called containing myths. We may give it other names. There are different languages from different philosophies to this notion of the cosmic master signifier into which we are pushed or in which we find ourselves. And then at some point, we have to wrest an identity out of that. We have to decide whether we buy into it or not, because we've been co-opted into it. So that becomes the beginning of this analysis and search or research that we are talking about, and all of you were talking about today. So then what remains, I think, because and today we talk about the Anthropocene, which means it's no longer small traditional containers. We are talking about a master container that has actually absorbed the earth. It's the geological era. It's no longer even the psychological era. It's really marked the entire geos, right? The territory of the geos. So where do we go from there? So I think that's one of the first things. It was everywhere in all your talks. It was present. The notion of the fact that this is not merely just a individual, traumatic experience, but that it's a world situation, and that the solutions we can offer are first for ourselves, but also for the world, because we are answering a world situation. So how do we go about doing that? And it has to be done by the individual, for the individual first. And this is the whole thing about what you're all calling a personal container myth, right? So the personal container myth, however, is also an approach to a universal container myth. It's not there cannot be a single container myth, but it is an approach to, it's an attempt to open others to their own personal possibilities of building something that relates. And I really appreciated how Hemalatha presented it, a myth as something that relates the personal to the cosmic, that individuates one. So this question of individuation from that point of view, which is a very important question in our times. It's important because in the past, we were also given containers. We were given mythical containers, but we were not given necessarily individuation. We were given containers as containers of anonymous well-being within that particular frame. But today, we are on the one hand enclosed by a container myth, on the other hand, fragmented into isolation. It's a paradoxical and ironic coexistence. It's invisible. The machine has disappeared into us, and yet it's a universal machine. At the same time, we are alone. Each one is alone. There is no other, comfort community from which to develop your container myth. But this container is still, in a sense, arising out of a relationship with tradition or with traditions, with a variety of ways of the past. And I think this also relates to technology, as Jean-Michel was raising that question. Technology is not just, the machines with which we live. That's what technology is today. It's all the ways by which the past lives with us today. It includes oral technologies of transmission, ways by which these myths of the past, and even when we are developing it entirely by ourselves, with relationships with nature, with the moon and its cycles, it relates to a variety of others who have thought about these things and have used these technologies and have transmitted these technologies. And today we have other technologies for transmitting these technologies that can become, their own kinds of poison, but they can also become their own kinds of transmissions. So I think that was touched on, which is wonderful. Finally, the notion of the cosmic, of the fact that the individual container myth today cannot be anymore something that belongs to any single culture. That by the nature of the anthropocentric cultures are merging, fusing into each other. The notion of the heterocultural is around us. And we can codify it and make it monocultural or even cross-cultural or even transcultural. But the heterocultural is where the individual is trying to move to certain roots, which ultimately are porous and are creating a new world. So to be conscious of that, I think that's where the question that came up from a number of people, are we looking for, if we find it somewhere in the past, if we find it in Advaita Vedanta, if we find it in the goddess cults of Tantra, if we find it in Japanese, cultural norms of a certain time that are talking about the intermediate space, from there, where do we take it? Do we see it there as a golden past? Or do we see it as something that merges into a certain kind of an idea that has always been plural, and that has received influences from everywhere in being what it is, and that is calling us today? So one thing that I feel is that the notion of the expressive, it is not merely about the escape. It's not merely about the discovery, about the finding of a space, a body without organs, but it is about making new organs. It's about expression. So that is one thing. How do we move, firstly, out of that which co-opts us? But secondly, how do we move back into that? Now, moving back into that is always a political act. And I think that fact has to be understood and clearly, included in in that sense, activism, research as activism. Whatever you're doing is activistic. It is, in a sense, in relationship with the world around you and the container myth in which you find yourself co-opted. And the other thing to realize is that it is in acts that it is carried. That's the nomadism of it. The nomadism or the trans-nomadism of it is not in the fact that we are using many cultures at the same time. It is in the fact that it's always an answer to the moment. It's the activistic answer to the here and now, which changes. The problematic, the same problem, is being configured specifically, uniquely, and in a singular manner for every occasion that meets you. And that's where the heterogeneity of our relationship with the past and its transmission into the present becomes political. So I think those are some of the very interesting ideas that have been generated by this panel. Very rich, beautiful panel. And I'll leave it at this point, turning it over to Jonathan to initiate the next panel.
Yes, thank you so much, Debashish. That was a profound response. Definitely ideas to come back to as our all of our problems collectively and individually shift and morph. So I think that concludes this morning, or this first session of the morning. We're going to take a 15-minute break and come back with panel 2, which is in the Earth Cardinal Point, called Parapsychology, Shamanism, and Ancestral Remembrance, moderated by our very own EWP adjunct faculty, Kimmy Johnson. So we'll see you back here in 15 minutes.